fight, ladies. We're going to be watching another one of those presidential videos, a special edition. Can you turn the lights off?
And will you please close the door?
The Comanche Empire, from 1850s to 1870s. They were from the Southwest, traded with Texans. They were the most powerful tribe, and they hunted buffalo.
Natives fought on both sides in the Civil War and sometimes used the country's diversion to expand their territory. They were distracted by their own war, so they weren't as bothered by the natives. The Comanche Empire was the most powerful tribe. They were in the southwest of the United States, started out small, got a lot of alliances, stole horses, supplies, kidnapped settlers, and people from other tribes. Their empire was equal in power to the U.S. or the Republic of Mexico. The U.S. Army was fighting them because they had so much power. In 1858, over 100 of their warriors were killed, including their chiefs, and a large number of women and children were taken as prisoners.
Part of the tribe felt that they should split because they didn't want to fight anymore. And then after the Civil War, some of them had raiding parties and they steal horses, steal cattle, and they traded with Texans. Once they joined the Confederacy, U.S. troops were stationed in U.S. cities. They started to have good trading relations with them. They began to be known as the Comanchados because of the twin. Mexican and Indian captives. They were especially women because they were needed as brides in New Mexico. And the government said that they would help these Comanchados become farmers on a plantation, but they just couldn't do the hunting and the stealing stuff that they had done before. And they also said that they'd give them gifts in exchange for them to stop doing that hunting and stealing. But the chiefs were not happy with this. They got a little angry, but in the end they signed a treaty.
The treaty was known as the Medicine Lodge Creek Treaty. The treaty provided them with a reservation that gave them the right to hunt on the open plains in the reservation. After all the peace efforts with the U.S. were unsuccessful, the army attacked the Comanche and forced them onto a reservation.
The Navajo and Apache Indians dominated New Mexico. The Navajo were warlike. Apaches saw Navajo as their enemies, and they were both relentlessly assaulted during the war.
So when I dabbled at Harvard, I learned a lot about the Navajos and the Apaches. I learned that the Navajos really dominated New Mexico, Colorado, and Kansas. And then that during the Civil War, the U.S. relentlessly assaulted both tribes. And when the Union General James H. Carleton found out that the Confederates of the region had already been defeated by the natives, he was like, what the heck? And he attacked both tribes. The army then invaded the Apache land and confined about 400 of them at the Bosque Redondo. It was the new reservation. Carleton appointed Kit Carson to lead the attack against the Navajos because they were a larger tribe, and then Carson told the Navajos, go back to Bosque Redondo or we will pursue and attack you, and he kept to his word. Carson marched into the heartland of the Navajos, Canyon de Chelly, and destroyed their orchards, crops, and livestock. He started attacking people that didn't go and forced them to surrender or die of starvation. Eventually, 8,000 Navajos were forced on a long walk to Bosque Redondo, which was 300 miles. The reservation was a failure because the Apache saw the Navajo as their enemy and had no interest in cooperating with the other tribe. The land in New Mexico also couldn't contain them, and the Comanches saw the confined reservation as a target to attack. After the Civil War, a Congressional Peace Commission visited Bosque Redondo and realized the whole situation had created a huge mess. Navajos signed a treaty that allowed them to return to a reservation in their homeland. These struggles brought the Navajo tribe more closer together, and they became the Navajo Nation. They stopped raiding and went back to their old ways. Then they grew from 10,000 to 30,000 in 36 years, which was very strange for a Native American tribe.
The Modocs and Nez Perce. Many fights with the U.S. Army. The Modocs and Nez Perce hated reservations, and the Nez Perce escaped to Canada.
It was right before the Civil War, and settlers were coming to California from left and right in hope to find gold. Although treaties were negotiated to create small reservations for the tribes, the influx of the settlers were hard on the natives. Settlers ignored the restrictions because they believed they could find gold on the natives' land. The Modocs despised reservation life, which led to many fights and deaths between them and the U.S. Army. The Nez Perce felt the same, but they wanted to end the fighting and tried to flee to Canada.
The Lakota Sioux, the largest tribe in the northern Great Plains. Its important people include its leader, Red Cloud, and Sitting Bull. By far, the Sioux was the largest tribe in the northern Great Plains. This tribe was led by a man named Red Cloud. The Sioux began to attack and kill U.S. troops, but instead of creating war, the U.S. government wanted peace with the Lakota and their allies. The peace agreement that they proposed was the Treaty of Fort Laramie. This treaty seemed like a win for the Sioux tribe, but one sect of the Sioux was led by a man named Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull openly criticized the government's promises and was skeptical of the compromise. Less than a decade after that treaty was signed, their government ordered that the Lakota exit their territory because gold had recently been discovered. So they went back on that promise that the treaty had said. And the Sioux did not comply with this, and all that tension caused the Great Sioux War to begin. This war was full of ups and downs for both the troops and the Lakota Sioux. Perhaps the most well-known battle was the Indian victory at the Battle of Little Bighorn. This feeling of success did not last long, though, for the Sioux. During that next period of depression and great struggle, a man named Wovoka started what was called the Ghost Dance movement. Led by Wovoka, the Ghost Dance movement was part of a religious awakening among the Lakota Sioux in 1890, in which they believed that if they returned to their traditional ways and ceremonies, the whites would be driven from their land. This movement inspired the Sioux and greatly intimidated the whites. This period of inspiration, like the Sioux victory at the Battle of Little Bighorn, did not last long, and the Sioux tribe was defeated and was also forced onto reservations. Many important policies and government changes shaped life in the late 1800s, such as the Homestead Act, Grant's Peace Policy, and the Dawes Act.
So when I dabbled at Yale, I learned that after the Civil War, the pressure for space for white settlement really intensified. In 1862, President Lincoln, my main man, signed the Homestead Act. This act provided 160 acres of federal land to a family that would settle for 5 years. The land initially came from the buffalo hunting lands, like Kansas, Minnesota, Iowa. In addition to farming and buffalo hunting, mineral wealth in the Dakotas brought more whites and more racial conflict. With so much tension, Congress created the Indian Peace Commission to negotiate treaties with the Plain tribes. This commission thought reserved land for the Indians would protect them from encroaching white settlement. This seemed like the best option because the government was running out of room to push the tribes west, so confining them together in small amounts of land allowed most of the land in the west to be open to the whites. Ulysses S. Grant became president and initiated a new peace policy known as Grant's Peace Policy. He wanted both room for the white settlement and to treat the Indians with dignity. Grant's whole idea was to assimilate the natives with the whites through proper teaching and treatment. However, the natives didn't want to assimilate. Grant appointed a member of the Seneca tribe as the first Native American Commissioner of Indian Affairs, the first non-white to hold a high government position. Grant declared the reservations off limits to the army, even the troops that had been fighting with the tribes. The army simply ignored the order. In fact, when General Sherman defeated the Comanches, he was praised, not even reprimanded. By the 1800s, there was general agreement from white government officials that natives needed to assimilate with whites by leaving their old reservations. In response to that, Congress passed the Dawes Act, which divided the reservations into 160 acres to be assigned to each family.
The Dawes Act was an 1887 law terminating tribal ownership of most reservation land and allocating some parcels to individual Indians, while the remainder was opened for white settlement. While some tribes were able to avoid the effects of the Dawes Act, for many the act was an economic and cultural disaster. The Transcontinental Railroad gained widespread support in the 1850s. The first was completed in 1869, and it was an essential economic link.
In 1853, there was a survey that offered 4 possible routes across the country, various landing in Portland, San Francisco, Los Angeles, or San Diego. They were all considered and debated over. And then once the Southerners departed from Congress because of the Civil War, a northern route became the obvious choice to the remaining members. The federal government provided 400-foot right-of-way, federal loans, and major land grants to the 2 railroads. The war made construction move very slowly. The hard physical labor was done mostly by Irish workers on the Union Pacific and Chinese laborers on the California-based Central Pacific. And those starting construction in California encountered much more difficulty because they had to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains. Oh my. All the country's large cities were connected by rail. A city without a rail link was doomed to wither. Also, technological changes helped extend the railroads, like George Westinghouse's air brake system that made trains safer and rides smoother, or Eli Janey's silly man, his system for coupling and decoupling rail bridges. Unlike when traveling was restricted to horse or wagon, trains needed to follow a strict schedule on departing and arriving times. Schedules required something no one had ever considered before: standardized time. All American communities adjusted their clocks to one of the 4 time zones that the country split into. These time zones still regulate our lives today. The railroads allowed isolated economies to become part of the national commercial network. Another perk was that the railroad ended at docks where steamships carried food and other materials to Asia, South America. Also, cost of transporting foods dropped greatly. I would have loved to have been alive then. This railroad opened new jobs, which created wealth for some and linked the nation's economy to world markets. In a sense, it connected the U.S. to the world more than anything else ever had.
Now, let's look at how cowboys, cattle, the open range, and barbed wire affected our history.
In Texas, white families discovered that if they crossbreed cattle of Spanish in origin and Anglo-American stock, they could create a better, stronger breed of cows. The new cows could survive off of grass. They were resistant to Texas fever, which killed many of the old cows. As people went to fight the Civil War, even though the Comanches hunted the cattle, they returned home from war to still an abundance of cows. There was an increase in cattle ranching as people tried to reassemble herds as they returned to the land. The times were prosperous and Americans ate a lot of beef. Cowboys, young single men who had spent many months following the herd, were ready to party when they got to town. These saloons that they went to provided one of the only opportunities of work for women in the industry, if you know what I mean. As demand for beef increased and cowboys brought more cattle into the railroad towns, development in the rail industry made cattle more profitable. Unfortunately, the rail cars were not well refrigerated and meat often spoiled. As the cattle business became controlled by larger corporations, cowboys became less independent and more like hired workers. Barbed wire fences gained popularity at the time in order to contain their cattle. Unfortunately, some winters were incredibly harsh and killed off many cattle, and another depression began in the 1890s. Not very good, no, not good at all. People began to demand higher quality beef, and it turned to smaller ranches that were family run instead of large-scale corporations.
Throughout much of the West, the battle between those who wanted to fence and control the land and those who wanted free grazing land for their herds was one of the greatest divides. There was a huge clash between the people who wanted to fence off private property and those who wanted open prairies. The Mexican believes that any land that was not specifically part of the home or irrigated farmland of one family was held in common. Investors from the East Coast and Britain could not imagine anything other than private ownership and began to fence their properties to create cattle ranches. Longtime residents were threatened by the borders created by the fences and wanted to cut them down. When ranchers didn't comply with a request to take down their fences, a secret organization called the Whitecaps reopened the ranches.
New techniques of farming to cultivate areas where only buffalo herds had roamed only a short time before. Immigrants from Europe and Mexico, former slaves, and Indians were a part of the many who started these new farms. Many that traveled to Kansas failed and didn't create successful farms. The Homestead Act of 1862 made acres of land available to those who settled. Due to this act and the new railroads, settlements continued to increase, as did the amount of farmers.
The gold rush in California was the first rush of people to seek wealth in the minerals of the West. Mining and the quest for mineral wealth continued to lead to fortunes and to death in the West. Seemingly, overnight, new towns emerged wherever there was mining for gold, silver, copper, and lead mines. Mining was seen as male work and typically did not lead to settled life. Although people tried to get individual wealth, most of the money was found by large corporations.
The West of the late 1800s could be a very violent place. Despite what Hollywood depicts, cowboys and Indians tended to keep their distance from each other. Ranch owners hired professional gunfighters to eliminate people that they saw as troublemakers. Much of the violence was local and personal. Some was just disagreements about the development of the region, and some was a carryover from the Civil War. William Cody created the greatest legend of the Wild West, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show in the 1880s. It included scenes from Indian battles, Indian dancing, robberies, and always demonstrated the shooting powers of Annie Oakley. It was not a true representation of the West and was full of stereotypical imagery. These shows were performed all over the country and were a great source of entertainment.
In the 1880s, much of the western United States was organized into territories that were controlled by the U.S. government rather than states.
Soon, many western states began to be admitted into the country, such as California, Minnesota, Oregon, Kansas, Nevada, Nebraska, Colorado, North and South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming.
Utah was delayed statehood for many years due to the polygamy that occurred in some Mormon communities. This caused many controversies and debates on whether or not Utah should become a state. In 1890, the Mormon Church announced the end of plural marriage, and many members went along with the decision. With this issue resolved, Utah was finally granted statehood.
Awesome. All right, group work time.